Bueno, quiero empezar diciendo que yo no le hago el honor a nadie, más bien el honor es todo mío por estar aquí hoy, pero muchas gracias en cualquier caso. Muy buenas tardes y muchas gracias a todos y a todas los que nos acompañan hoy en esta ocasión de gran regocijo. Quiero expresar mis respetos en primer lugar a las autoridades universitarias encabezadas por el rector, el maestro David Fernández, y seguidos por todos mis compañeros, espero que me disculpen por no mencionarlos. También quiero expresar mis respetos a los honorables invitados que nos acompañan hoy. Agradezco en particular a Monseñor Efraín Mendoza, obispo auxiliar de Tlalnepantla, a los rectores del sistema, a los ex-rectores que también están aquí hoy con nosotros y a los miembros del patronato FICSAC. A todos, muchas gracias y muy buenas tardes. Es para mí un gran honor, para mí, haber sido elegido hoy para darle la bienvenida a nuestro conferencista magistral en esta ceremonia de celebración del 75º aniversario de la Universidad Iberoamericana, el maestro Pankaj Mishra. Voy a proceder a hacerlo intentando responder al menos dos preguntas. Pregunta número 1, ¿por qué? ¿Por qué elegimos a Pankaj Mishra para que esté aquí hoy? ¿Y por qué deben escucharlo cuidadosamente? ¿Por qué deben prestar atención a sus palabras? La pregunta número 2 sería, ¿por qué creímos que esos temas son importantes? A la primera pregunta, ¿por qué elegimos a Pankaj para que estuviera aquí hoy? Puedo responder diciéndoles que Pankaj Mishra ha sido considerado por la revista Time como uno de los 50 pensadores más influyentes de la actualidad. Ha sido visiting professor en el prestigioso Wellesley College durante más de 5 años, fellow del Cullman Center for Writers and Scholars en Nueva York, visiting fellow en el University College en Londres, fellow de la Royal Society of Literature, y en el año 2014 recibió uno de los premios universitarios más importantes del mundo, el Wyndham Campbell en Yale University. Puedo responderles también diciéndoles que estudió su Bachelor of Arts en la Universidad de Allahabad y su Master of Arts en Literatura Inglesa en la Universidad Nehru de Nueva Delhi, dos de las instituciones más prestigiosas de la India. Ha recibido innumerables premios, solo destaco algunos: el Art Seidenbaum de Los Angeles Times, el Lionel Gelber en Canadá, el George Orwell en Reino Unido, el Asia Society Book Award en Estados Unidos o finalmente el Leipzig Book Award for European Understanding, entre otros. Los estudios que le han permitido alcanzar esas distinciones son también numerosos. Citaré solo a título de ejemplo dos de los que me parecen más importantes: Temptations of the West, How to be Modern in India, Pakistan and Beyond, y From the Ruins of Empire, the Revolt Against the West and the Remaking of Asia. El año pasado apenas publicó el aclamado Age of Anger, la época de la ira. Y eso me lleva a la pregunta número 2. Respondo a la pregunta número 2, ¿por qué creímos que esos temas son importantes? Recordando cómo hoy, en todas las sociedades, en todo el mundo, la violencia se ha convertido en uno de nuestros compañeros de viaje. La violencia ya no es una coyuntura, es una estructura con la que hemos aprendido a disgusto que debemos convivir. ¿Cómo podemos explorar los orígenes de esa violencia? No solo explorarlos, sino proporcionar un marco de interpretación y de pensamiento capaz de explicar lo que parece inexplicable. ¿Cómo podemos enfrentar las oleadas de odio, de agresividad, de paranoia, que van desde la matanza de Parkland en Florida hace apenas unos días al ISIS, desde Trump al nacionalismo, el racismo y la misoginia en los medios de comunicación? En la era de la ira, publicado, como decía, el año pasado, Pankaj Mishra nos proporciona esos marcos epistemológicos capaces de enfrentar esta enorme y profunda urgencia que nos acosa como ninguna otra en nuestros tiempos. En estos días en los que he podido disfrutar de su compañía y por los que le estoy profundamente agradecido, he podido apreciar la profundidad de un pensamiento filosófico preocupado por toda una serie de cuestiones. Y a continuación cito sus palabras. Pankaj está preocupado no por si la democracia ha retrocedido, sino por las razones por las que la democracia lo ha hecho. Está preocupado por si el relato de que la modernidad nos ha proporcionado maravillas no es más que una fantasía. Está preocupado por el hecho de que deseos, emociones, avaricia y posverdad son recursos para la persuasión violenta en las sociedades contemporáneas. Está preocupado por esa humillante retirada de la democracia con las inevitables consecuencias que sufrimos hoy de injusticia, inequidad y maltrato a las minorías. Está preocupado por el uso de los medios de masas, que en lugar de procurar una sociedad formada, educada e informada, sirven solo a los poderosos frente a los desposeídos. Y finalmente, y con eso termino, proporcionando una visión realista, que no optimista, al reconocer el papel del activismo social, de movimientos como Me Too o el movimiento de los estudiantes contra las armas en Estados Unidos, o finalmente de una frase que pronunció y yo apunté de inmediato: necesitamos cambiar el yo por el nosotros y de esa manera reconocer la trampa del individualismo en las sociedades contemporáneas. Por favor, únanse a mí en un aplauso para darle la bienvenida a Pankaj Mishra.
Thank you very much, Javier, for that very kind introduction. I have to say, this is a great privilege for me to be part of this ceremony, this beautiful ceremony. And the more I know about this university, the more privileged I feel to be here, in that the university, at least in various other places in the global south that I've seen, are very rarely more than degree granting institutions or training people for a professional life. But a university with the kind of social commitment that Iberoamericana has, I know is extremely, extremely rare, and it's been inspiring to be here, to talk to some of the students here, and to know the ways in which their minds are working, in the ways in which they are engaging with the realities around them. It's been very, very inspiring. So thank you for having me here. Distinguished guests, I think we can probably all agree that we are living through a time of political earthquakes. Practically every month, there is a reminder that the world as we have known it no longer exists. It can be something that happens in India, it can be something in the United States with Trump's victory, with Brexit, the other day in the Italian elections. I know there's an important election coming up here in July. The question for me in recent years has been, how do we understand this universal crisis? And it is universal. A crisis that is as much moral and spiritual as it is political. And here I must say, I speak from my own experience of growing up in India, of spending most of my adult life in a country that actually resembles Mexico a great deal. In fact, very early in my life, I was alerted to this comparison between India and Mexico by one of your most distinguished writers, Octavio Paz, who, as you know, spent a lot of time in India. He wrote about it, and he also compared the two countries. And it became very clear when I read him that both of us, both countries, were faced with a similar challenge. Countries, societies that were highly unequal, deeply hierarchical, full of violence and injustice of various kinds, faced with the challenge of becoming modern, of embracing ideas of equality, of liberty, of individual rights. How were we to achieve this modernity? That still remains an urgent question for both these societies. Now, in India, I remember growing up with some clear ideas about how we were going to achieve this modernity. We claimed that India as a country was socialist, and secular, and democratic, and we were going to industrialize, we were going to accelerate economic growth, we were going to learn the language of the modern West, Western Europe, and the United States, and then take our rightful place amongst this international community of nations. So it was a very clear cut trajectory of how we were going to move towards modernity. Of course, as a country that had been colonized, that had suffered from imperialism, there was always the possibility that we were in a race that we were bound to lose, that the scramble for dignity, resources, was going to end in failure. But what our leaders proposed, and not just in India, but Asia, Africa, our first nationalist leaders, what they said, what they told us, their citizens, was we are going to catch up. We are going to catch up with the modern West. So this was the project, and this was also the basis of the legitimacy of the ruling classes in Asia and Africa. Now, if you pause for a moment and think about modernization in a country like India, with its large population, some people still living a kind of pre modern life, agrarian society, still very close to the land, and then a tiny elite in urban areas, which constitutes the ruling class, which designs, which creates ideas about how people are going to achieve modernization. I think when you think about this for a minute, you realize that modernization was an extraordinary project. It remains an extraordinary project because what it means is persuading hundreds of millions of people to renounce a world that had endured for thousands of years, to renounce that world of tradition, of custom, and then ask them to participate in this elite led gamble of creating modern citizens who would be secular, enlightened, and cultured. What this process of modernization required, it's become clear today, is the deliberate undermining, if not wholesale destruction, of ethnic, religious diversity for the sake of an imagined goal that one day our societies in the global south would become like Europe and America. They would become rational, they would become more secular as economic growth accelerates. Now, of course, there were people pointing to problems in this project, pointing to its contradictions. Octavio Paz was one of them. I remember a line of his from The Labyrinth of Solitude, where he writes, imperialism has not allowed us to achieve historical normality. When he wrote this, he was looking at the confused legacy of Mexico from colonial rule and the failure of its many political and social economic programs to make the country reenact the rise of Europe and North America. But as I said, he could have been speaking of any Asian and African country that had suffered long after decolonization the intellectual as well as geopolitical and economic hegemony of Western Europe and the United States, and had failed to find its own way of being modern. Octavio Paz himself was convinced that Mexico or India had to forge a modern politics and economy for itself. But it's interesting that when he was writing in the late 40s, after having witnessed the deceptions of liberal constitutionists, he found himself admiring the traditionalism of the revolutionary Emiliano Zapata. It was he, Paz wrote, who had freed Mexican reality from the constricting schemes of liberalism and the abuses of the conservatives and the new conservatives. Now, there were other people in Asia and Africa who were saying similar things. There's an Indonesian thinker, Sojat Moko, a very important figure, who in the early 70s was saying that this project of modernization for us is not going to succeed. What it is creating are more inequalities instead of reducing inequalities, and that is going to endanger the possibility, the prospect of democracy in our countries. If you have a crowded, hungry, and competitive world, that would only lead to increasing pressures towards greater authoritarianism and oppression. And as he wrote, human freedom will be the first victim of such a future. And of course, there's a whole tradition of thinkers in Asia, from Mahatma Gandhi to Rabindranath Tagore, who were warning against these possibilities in the early 20th century. Because what they realized that this whole process of modernization, which had been disruptive and traumatic even in Europe, even in America, had involved a lot of violence, a lot of dispossession, would be even more so in the non-West. It was going to disrupt old economies, agriculture, small crafts, draw young people away to the squalor of new urban centers, would break or loosen their religious and communal attachments that had given meaning to their lives, and expose their raw nerves to extremist politics. And that this was a process that did not lead directly, even in the West itself, to a clear destination of happiness or stability. And many of the supposed benefits, like mass education or cheap consumer goods, popular press, mass entertainment, all that had only partly relieved a widely and deeply felt rootlessness, confusion, and alienation. So these intellectuals became some of the most eloquent and earliest critics of modernity, of capitalist modernity. And they were using conceptions, other conceptions of the meaning and purpose of human life to counter this assumption that industrialization, economic self interest, individualism would be a miracle, would be a miraculous cure for the problems of the human condition. And they often drew upon philosophical and spiritual traditions, is Hinduism or Islam or Confucianism, to develop a very refined suspicion of this new world of science and reason. And they were insisting that there are aspects of human existence that are non rational, that are non utilitarian. And in many ways, they anticipated Europe's own thinkers who, after the First World War, were forced to examine their beliefs in a world becoming progressively more peaceful and rational. So almost every country in major country in Asia produced these thinkers warning their ruling classes against a blind imitation of the institutions and ideologies of Western Europe and the United States. Because what they were saying was that, this kind of modernity has been achieved through means that are not available to others, most importantly, imperialism. And many of these people, I'll only give you one example, also developed a vision based on actually existing conditions in their respective societies. I was very struck by the president describing how the task of Jesuit institutions has been to respond to local conditions, to local realities. And here were people doing that. There's an Indian scholar called Radhakamal Mukherjee who developed this vision of supporting environmentally sustainable, small scale industries over American style factories. And he inspired in the 1960s urban planners in many countries, including Brazil. I think it's worth asking for many of us today, why did these figures disappear? Why did their influence fade? One answer, of course, is the pressures of nation building. There were just too many geopolitical imperatives and pressures on many countries in Asia and Africa, so they had no real scope, no real space in which to experiment with these other ways of achieving modernity. What they ended up doing, whether you're in Iran or in Indonesia, were reading Western guidebooks. So people, the advisors to the Shah of Iran, were reading a very famous book in its time by Walt Rostow, American official and writer, called The Stages of Economic Growth. And they were reading these kinds of books more carefully than anything by their own thinkers. And of course, Lenin, Mao, even various other kinds of socialists were also a great influence on many people in Asia and Africa. And the traditionalism that Octavio Paz spoke about, or people who spoke for it, like someone like Gandhi in India, they were forgotten. They were reduced to an empty ritual. Development, that was the word we all grew up with, that we have to develop rapidly, urgently. And this was a common sense. This was a common sense of our lives. Anyone at that time who said that we have to have a less exploitative and instrumental view of human beings, of nature, that we have to have an ecologically and politically sustainable way of national growth, of national development, really suffered a rapid loss, rapid eclipse in their reputations. Because modernity on both the left and the right had become synonymous with a shared belief in a dream of boundless, endless consumption. So, whether you were a socialist or whether you're a capitalist, you were thinking of an exponential, you were imagining an exponential increase in the number of people dominating the earth, owning cars, houses, electronic goods, gadgets, driving the tourist luxury industries worldwide. A kind of fantasy that in the last 2, 3 decades has been truly globalized and synergizes the endeavors of politicians, businessmen, journalists everywhere. So that's extraordinary confluence of ideas that this is the only way to modernize. This was given even more strength, this kind of thinking, starting the 1980s, late 1980s, when ideas of a certain kind of aggressive, individualistic capitalism that had been discredited after the great crises of the first half of the 20th century, they made a comeback in Western Europe and the United States. People like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher started to speak of a particularly aggressive kind of capitalism and started to present it as a way for faster growth, more efficiency, better deployment of resources. And these ideas emerging from Western Europe and the United States suddenly became part of a revolution, a new liberal revolution, sweeping across, of course, Latin America and also large parts of Asia and Africa. I think we have not paid, I feel, not much attention to how even our leaders in the global south, how influenced they have been by these ideas that they have absorbed from American universities, European universities, business schools, commercial organizations, philanthropic foundations, corporations, of course, and also such American dominated organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, is these incubators that the political, intellectual norms of the West are internalized. And then people go back to their respective countries and they start implementing these ideas. They occupy prominent positions wherever they are. And this kind of interfacing between non-Western elites and Western centers of power is how a particular interpretation of capitalism as a regime of privatization, deregulation, financial liberalization, this is how it became the basis for public policies worldwide and really defining a new way of living in and understanding the world. Of course, since 2008, since the financial crisis, this kind of capitalism has looked morally and intellectually very feeble. And now, of course, with the election of Donald Trump, these myths that if you follow this path, we will all be affluent and prosperous, all these myths that politicians, businessmen, journalists used to spread, they all lie shattered today. All the fantasies that we can export American style capitalism and democracy, if necessary through military force, they also lie shattered today. Europe, which used to be a great inspiration for many of us around the world, now looks very hapless towards in the face of these new crises that are constantly erupting. And I think what we are really looking at is a crisis that people in the global south used to experience very periodically, very regularly. That crisis has now erupted in the heart of the modern West. Of course, there's a difference, which is that unrest, decline, the prospect of decline in Europe and America comes at the end of a long cycle of steady growth. In many of the countries of the global south, where billions are still undergoing a traumatic transition from agrarian to urban industrial economies, this whole cycle of growth had barely begun before it began to falter. So, democracy, for instance, which was supposed to go together with capitalism, has been undermined by these new anarchic, hyper individualistic forms of capitalism that have ended up diminishing the legitimacy of the state, of elected representatives, and marginalizing the poor in many, many countries. So, one result is that many of our national consensuses, the basic ideas that we all agreed upon when we started the project of nation building, of modernization, those have fragmented because the ideology of endless growth, private wealth creation, individual self interest, which is what neoliberalism is all about, that has turned into an elemental force undermining the internal unity of many, many societies. The societies are fragmented, there are greater inequalities, greater hierarchies, greater selfishness. The whole ethic of primitive accumulation, individual gratification, has undermined many, many of our social compacts across the global south. And what I think is primarily responsible for this is the rise of inequality. China, which was once the world's most egalitarian society, is now even more unequal than the United States. 1% of its population owns one third of the national wealth. And what you see in these societies, when they are unable to maintain their national cohesion and unity in the face to in the face of the imperative to privatize basic services like water, health, education, they gravitate towards a kind of hardline nationalism. We see that in China, we see that in India, we see that in many countries around the world today. And at the same time, you have a situation where capital is mobile, it's transnational, and it has made state building, resources building, all the original goals of collective welfare, social uplift, much more difficult to achieve within national boundaries. And during this whole fragmentation, process of fragmentation, the elites who have primarily benefited from neoliberalism have had to devise new ways to legitimize their rule, to make their dominance seem natural. So, countries like India, for instance, or Israel, which started out as nation states committed to social justice, have seen their foundational ideals radically reconfigured by a nexus of neoliberal politicians, technocrats, and majoritarian nationalists who try and bludgeon their disaffected subjects into loyalty to a Jewish state or a Hindu nation. And we see also in various other countries the demagogues emerging at the head of populations that are angry and fearful about being deprived of these fruits of modernity, which are only going to a tiny minority. So, the implications of all this, I feel, are very sobering in that the non West or the global South not only finds itself replicating the kind of violence, injustice that we saw in the West itself on an infinitely larger scale, and it's inflicting the profoundest damage yet on the environment, which we see today in rising sea levels, erratic rainfall, drought, declining harvests, devastating floods. While it is inflicting this damage on the environment, the global south has no real prospect of catching up with the West. This is a political failure, I feel, but it's also an intellectual failure. And I, I think in most of what I've written, I've tried to engage with this question of how do we chart our way out of this impasse, this stalemate. At one level, my effort has been to discover other writers who discovered, who saw the tragic contradictions of this kind of modernization. Of course, many thinkers in the East and the West question this exalting of economic growth as an end in itself. They knew that other ways of conceiving of the good life, of a moral society, have existed, have existed long before the idea that greed can be institutionalized or individual freedom is equal to consumer choice, long before these ideas became institutionalized, entrenched in our own societies. So we have to pay attention to the discourse of many of these thinkers who, as I said, were forgotten, were neglected, because Western power, cultural, military, economic, has created the categories in which we think about the world today. Most of our arguments, examples, generalizations, presuppositions are drawn from the stock of European or American historical experience. And what this has done is the experience of a vast majority of the world's population have been erased. And recovering them today, recovering those experiences, recovering those ideas is more urgent in our post American world, because that whole idea that's the spell of universal progress through Western style capitalism, Western style democracy has been broken. The idea, the assumption that these universalist ideologies will deliver endless growth, political stability cannot be sustained, whether you're in India or any other part of the non West. We face a global crisis, social, political, environmental, that puts into question, above all, our long intellectual submission to these Western ideas of progress and development. So, what we need, in other words, is a fullest range of intellectual resources in order to reimagine the non West or what we can do. Something that just doesn't involve playing catch up with the West. It seems imperative that our diverse, plural societies redefine their principles in ways that acknowledge different visions, religious, metaphysical, of the world. One of my great influences is this French thinker called Simone Weil, who very early in the 1930s recognized that this whole standardized model of progress had to be replaced. For the values of individualism, individual autonomy that had originally brought forth the modern world, those very ideals had come to threaten the moral identity and spiritual health of human beings. She wrote a very famous book called The Need for Roots in 1943 while France was under Nazi occupation. In that book, she went so far as to abandon the whole language of individual rights. She argued that this idea of individual rights had been crucial to the expansion of commerce, commercial society in Western Europe. But she argued that a free and rooted society ought to consist of a web of moral obligations. We have the right to ignore starving people, she said, but we should be obliged not to let them starve. I feel in our own context, we need to relearn the importance of, as this Colombian anthropologist Arturo Escobar puts it, place non capitalism and local culture against the dominance of space, capital, and modernity that are central to globalization discourse. The third world, Octavia Paz once said, is condemned to modernity. But again, the question really is what kind of modernity? Can it be one that emphasizes cooperation over competition? Can it be one that speaks of a concept of development that does not aim at affluence but at sufficiency? A concept of individual rights and ownership that is limited by the secular good. I feel that we have to examine many of our trajectories, many of our ideas, many of our ideologies and institutions, because as we now know in this season of political earthquakes, that the ideas that we have grown up with, that we have internalized of progress, they have unraveled. They require a broader redefinition. We need to renegotiate a new common space. The whole idea of a state as something that is essentially there to, to, to create a business-friendly environment that is there to boost economic growth. We need to discard those ideas. We need to rethink the role of the state, the role of the elites. And it'll be difficult. It will be difficult because the power of old elites has derived from their role, from their self-appointed role as modernizers, as technocrats, and as I said, their links with various transnational corporations, Western institutions, international organizations are very, very strong. But this is a moment of opportunity, I feel, with these great global crises. Because what we are seeing today are new relationships emerging, reconfigured identities, new forms of political mobilization in the new gaps that have opened up within and across states. So, what Octavio Paz called the constricting schemes of old style liberalism, conservatism, and new conservatism, which have been promoted globally by people trained in Western style institutions or in United States and Europe, all those things that have continued to shape much of our thinking about the world, those schemes can be radically revised today. It is true that imperialism, intellectual imperialism, has not allowed many in the non-West, the global South, to achieve clear self-reckonings. But it is hard to deny today that the assumptions that we have lived with for so long lie broken today. And we are all faced with plural futures. And those plural futures call for new thinking, new intellectual heresies. Thank you and happy anniversary, Iberoamerica.
Quiero invitar al doctor Alejandro Guevara, vicerrector de la universidad, a hacer entrega a Pankaj Mishra el reconocimiento de la medalla de plata de San Ignacio de Loyola.
Muchísimas gracias. Lo que le decía es que le estamos dando la medalla de plata a San Ignacio de Loyola, y recogiendo un poquito la tradición de San Ignacio y la Compañía de Jesús nacieron en una universidad, en la Universidad de París, y entonces pues agradecerle las ideas que nos ha brindado el día de hoy. Muchas gracias.